Okay. So I guess we can get started. Otherwise, I'll be slow in the introduction so that the latecomers will be able to join in without missing the important parts. So hello everybody. I'm very pleased to be presenting to you today what I view as a potential candidate for replacing the chronological feed. And more generally, I hope that this proposal could be a good foundation to build upon, to have especially follow-based recommender systems, but also beyond the recommendation, beyond being follow-based, hopefully this can set some foundations to then provide some democratic recommender systems. So I'm not going to be able, I'm going to try to switch a bit between the two screens, but whenever I switch slide, I have to move to another screen, so I won't be able to see you. So if you have any question at any point, especially if any need for clarification, please feel free to ask questions either out loud or in the chat. So the proposal is called Veche, the Assembly of Humans Recommenders. I'll try to explain why the name is quite suiting and why I also think it's quite a promising foundation for the future of recommender systems. But first, I want to insist on the problem. So the problem, if you're here, you probably know that at least in Tonsor, we believe that today's recommender systems are extremely dangerous, both from a mental health point of view and for democracies. So these are two of many ongoing cases or recent cases that have found the proprietary recommender systems of leading social media to be in violation with the law. And especially the case has been that these recommender systems are designed to be addictive, and they are generating some side effects that are extremely problematic for the mental health of the users and as well for the democracies. In particular, they have been qualified as dark patterns, and under the Digital Services Act in Europe, this is supposed to be forbidden. There has been also cases, arguments that they are presenting some systematic risks. You can typically think about discriminations, systematic discrimination against certain vulnerable groups. I'm not going to go on into too much of the details. If you're here, you probably also believe that these systems are an issue. What's interesting is that the application, especially of the Digital Services Act in the Netherlands, but perhaps also soon coming in the US, argues that instead of the proprietary recommender systems, we should go back to some chronological feeds, because chronological feeds seem transparent. Sometimes they are even argued to be not an algorithm as a design choice. And I think this is a huge issue, especially as we move forward, because if we consider that the alternative to proprietary recommender systems is the chronological feed, then we are kind of saying that the alternative is something bad. And that's because most of the people who use these systems, at least from my personal point of view, but I think it's also an issue when people are trying to move to Mastodon or to Blue Sky or to chronological feeds. If you try to go to your subscription, for instance, based feed on YouTube, then the experience is a lot worse than what you would get like using the classical recommender systems. So it's very important, I think, to not present the alternative to today's recommender systems as something that is inherently worse. We have to propose something that is like better than the chronological feed in terms of user experience. But even if you discard this issue, even if you're only saying, well, I want just safety by default, and I don't care if the user experience is a lot worse, the chronological feed is still highly criticizable. For one thing, it overvalues hyperactive accounts. So typically, if you are subscribed to a newspaper, typically Le Monde.fr, for instance, on YouTube or on Mastodon or Buskai, then you're going to see a lot of the activities from these accounts because they produce a lot more content than most other accounts. And this can be a problem. It's also a problem because it also incentivizes fast and massive content creation, because the more you produce, the more you get recommended by the chronological feed. And this is arguably a very bad incentive, especially in the current information ecosystem, where you need a lot more time to produce higher quality content. And finally, one last criticism I would make to the chronological feed is that it does have some social dimension, because you're following some accounts and you may just follow your friends, for instance. But arguably, it still lacks social dimension, because you don't see who recommends what. You just see the last recommendations, and you don't have an overview of what are the people in your that you follow, among the people that you follow, who follows what, who recommends what. And arguably, you can do a lot more through this social dimension to make these recommender systems more interesting. So the proposal is essentially to propose a feed that is going to be both chronological, at least partially, but also fair in some point of view. Especially the fairness I'm referring to here is the fairness between the different accounts that you follow. But what I will present will go a bit beyond this, because I also want to make ChronoFair part of a modular, evolutive, and interoperable framework, because I think this is how we should construct the future of the digital space in general, so that it's easier to integrate good, positive innovations, and so that we can also fix the issues with what we have. And Veche is the framework. Veche is sort of a general framework to construct recommender systems based on what people follow. So let me start by presenting now a very simple version of Veche, which I will call Veche 0.0. So it's not really what I'm proposing Veche to be. It's just for pedagogical reasons to start with something very simple. So first, a bit of words about the etymology of the word Veche. So Veche refers to popular assembly back in the Middle Ages in some Slavic peoples. And I really like the last sentence of the introduction of Wikipedia, which says that the last Veche meeting was held in Pskov, not sure about the pronunciation, in 1510. When the institution was abolished as part of the growing centralization of power in Russia. So arguably, by defending Veche, we are defending going back to the 1510, at least with regard to the centralization of power, which is arguably a huge issue on the internet. The key principle of Veche is the following. It says that when you're following someone, is as though you were allocating to this someone a unit right to influence, in particular, to influence your recommendation feed. So that's really the idea, is as though you were selecting the people you were giving a voting right to, and the voting right, it can then be used by these accounts that you follow to then push content into your recommendation feed to increase the chance that you will be recommended this content. So that's the key principle. And how do we instantiate it? Well, in practice, that whenever a user, a consumer, will ask for a feed, whenever they query a feed, typically when they go to they open their social media account. Then it's going to be then the followed accounts, the accounts that are followed by this consumer, will be submitting recommendations to be shown to this user. And then based on these recommendation submissions, we're going to have different entities. So an entity is typically a post on Blue Sky, or it can be a video on Tournesol. These different entities are given weights that sort of accumulate how much the accounts want to push the different entities. And then given the weights, given entity will be sample will be added to the feed with a probability that is proportional to the weight, or the entities that have higher weights will have a higher probability to be included in the feed. So hopefully this is all very clear. I think the principles are quite simple. Now, it does raise some issues in practice, because I mean, ideally, you could really imagine that for anytime someone is asking to be shown some content, then the accounts they follow are actually called, and they actually answer to the phone, and they have to submit actual recommendations. Of course, this is not realistic in practice, and this is unrealistic for two reasons. First is I'm not going to be available 24/7 to answer these calls, so it's too demanding in terms of latency, or in terms of always being live on the network to answer to these queries. So this is not feasible because of this. And there's another reason why it's not feasible, is that even if everybody was always able to answer, it would be extremely slow. Yet on social media, as we know, users expect an answer within a fraction of a second. Now, this is not the only setting where the time complexity of decision-making, of collaborative decision-making has been an issue. In particular, there are two interesting previous cases that have been studied in machine learning. The first is a case of food donation. So this was a part of an association that was called Food Rescue, which was collecting food donations from donors, typically supermarkets, leftovers from supermarkets. And they then had to select the recipients of the food donation. And this was a dilemma. Initially, it was answered by a single employee or volunteer of the association. But it was recognized as unsatisfactory. And then there was this research group from Carnegie Mellon University, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's CMU. They proposed that instead we do some democratic approach where you have different people who vote for where the food should be delivered. But of course, you don't want to call everyone every time, and you want a fast response. And so the trick was to create some algorithmic representatives. So each stakeholder would answer different different dilemma situations. So typically that would be shown two possible recipients in some fictitious food donation problems. And for instance, in this case, they may say, well, I would rather give to recipient A rather than to recipient B. And then this data would be used to train a machine learning model of the preferences of the stakeholder. And then all of these models would be, whenever there was a decision to be made, all of these models would be queried. And essentially, it was as though the algorithm that was representing the preferences of the stakeholder was voting in their behalf. So the algorithm would then be a sort of algorithmic representative of the user. And similarly, this idea was used for the car dilemma problem, the classical trolley dilemma for self-driving cars. Different voters would, different users here would be different web users would answer different dilemmas. So here, should the car go straight or drive towards the left? To the right of the screen. And in this situation, you would collect this kind of data and train a machine learning model that generalizes the preferences of each user. And then you would have these algorithmic representatives, these models of the preferences of the users, vote for what the cars should actually do in a practical dilemma. So how do we construct this algorithmic representative for the case of Veche? Well, here's a very simple solution. The very simple solution is the following. Well, essentially, whenever a user is posting or reposting an entity, it's as though they were voting for this entity to be recommended. And when they were voting against this entity, typically if they report this entity, then it would count as a vote against. So you would get a -1 as the base ballot weight. Otherwise, it would be a 0 weight. And then you would have a time decay to this quantity. So typically here, you would have at a time t, the ballot that actually submitted is, well, the initial ballot times this function here. This function is going to take a value between 0 and 1. No, actually, it's going to be between, I mean, it's going to be a positive number. When t is equal to TUE, so TU is the time at which the action was taken, or the post or the repost or the report was taken, then this is maximal. But when t goes to infinity, this goes to 0. So essentially, it's a time decay penalty, meaning that if you posted something years ago, like your algorithmic representative will not be pushing it much today. But if you've just done this, then it will the algorithmic representative will be pushing it a lot. Here, tau UE corresponds to the typical lifetime of the entity. So it could be set technically by the user themselves. So they could typically say, this is an entity that has a 1 day lifetime, for instance, in which case, after 1 day, the algorithmic representative will be pushing it twice, half as much, like less, after 1 day. And then it decreases quadratically. Now, then you would have this vector BU of BUE. So each user would be say, I want to push this that much. I don't want this to be recommended, and so on. But in order to limit the influence of any individual user, we simply propose a normalization of the vote of the user. So here, the vote would simply correspond to dividing the ballot BUE at time t by some normalization, which is the sum of the absolute values of the ballots. Meaning that if you had a lot of activities, so you're pushing a lot of entities, then your ballot, your weight will be spread among all of these entities. So you don't gain more by pushing more entities. So mathematically, this corresponds to dividing by the L1 norm of the ballot vector. And then we simply aggregate all of the ballots of the different users. So for an entity E, its weight WE will be simply the sum of the weights of all of the ballots of the different users for this entity E. And we take the non-negative part because if the weight is equal to 0, essentially the video will not be recommended. Okay, so with this, I can define a simple feed generator given this weight. So a feed is just a list of entities that are recommended, an ordered list. And so to construct this list, a simple solution would be sampling without replacement, meaning the first entity, but you just draw one entity proportionally to all the weights. So entities that have higher weights have a greater probability of being selected. Then you remove this and you add it to the feed. And then you keep on selecting the next one from the set of entities that have not been recommended yet. So this is called sampling without replacement. And this is a simple feed generator from weights. And so there you have it. We have defined the version 0.0 of Veche, which hopefully is quite simple. It's quite understandable, hopefully. It's simply everyone is pushing their ballots. We normalize them because we don't want someone who is more active to have more influence. Then we aggregate all of the ballots by taking their sum. We take the non-negative part because we're going to draw proportionally to the weights. And then we just we remove all of the entities that have 0 weight. So we only sampling among those that are judged recommendable by the users we follow. And then for each slot of recommendations, we pick with probability P proportional to the weight an entity E star here, which is added to the feed, and then we remove this entity from the set of entities that we can recommend. So that's Veche 0.0. Hopefully it's all clear. But if you have any question, please feel free to ask your questions. Now we're going to show, I'm going to try to show everything that can be done, not everything, but a lot of things that can be done by building beyond this starting building block. So first, I think the first thing we can do is to bias the ballots. So a bias is simply you take the ballots you would have given and you just modify it. So it's a map from R to the E to R to the E. And interestingly, the biasing of the ballots can happen either on the user, the human recommender side, or from the recommendee's perspective, from the consumer perspective. Both can bias the ballots as pleases them. So one way to bias the ballot is in terms of lifetime. So, like I already introduced this basic principle of biasing the ballots based on on time decay, essentially. But what I could do is also add this term here. So this term here may seem complicated. It's not the easiest to understand. But the nice thing about this term is that it will allow to control how much more you want to promote long-term content, long-term entities rather than short-term entities. This is because the overall push that you will be giving to an entity, so if you add up all of the pushes you give over time, then it gives this quantity here. So you have this left term here, pi divided by 2 BUE 0 here, which is, well, how much you push the entity. And you multiply this by this other quantity that depends on tau UE here, which is the lifetime of the entity. And so if the lifetime of the entity is large, then the log here will be large. And if gamma tau here is positive, it means that you're pushing overall more the quantity, the entities that have large values of tau UE, which means that you have a bias towards in favor of entities that are longer term. Conversely, if you are more like a news media, for instance, you may care less about long-term entity and you want to really push the news. This would correspond to taking a value that's negative of gamma tau here. So yeah, if you were wondering why I had this specific formula, is essentially because it allows you to have this nice interpretation. Yeah, so I'm sorry, it's a bit technical here. I mean, it's console talk. It's not meant to be for a very general audience. It's also partly because it's still under construction, and so I prefer to be a bit rigorous at this stage. Now, another thing, kind of bias that could be done. So arguably, this entity lifetime is more for the recommender side, the human recommender side. From the recommendee side, one thing that would be important is more making sure you're not always re-recommended entities that you've just been recommended. And so in order to do this, I have this simple idea of creating this geometric spacing through time of the recommendation. So it's okay if you recommend it again an entity, as long as there's some delay between the first recommendation and the next recommendation. And this delay, the idea is you increase this exponentially so that eventually it's not recommended anymore. So mathematically, it would correspond to fixing a delay between two recommendations, and then you have this geometric base of progression. And if the entity has already been recommended n e times, byte empty, then you don't recommend it for this amount of time. Yeah. Another interesting bias that we could add is a discoverability bias. So typically this would mean that I would prefer to recommend entities that have not been viewed that much thus far. And so there's even an incentive to do this, and we'll get to this when we talk about volumes. But essentially, if you are the only one recommending to the user an entity that the user actually really enjoyed, then it can be socially valued. I mean, can have some gamification of this, but it can also be valued in terms of the recommender that is able to do this will gain more volumes. We'll see what it means in a bit. Anyway, so the idea of the discoverability bias will correspond to this equation. So why this equation is interesting? So here you have a minimal number of views. The idea is that if an entity has fewer views than this n-min star here, then it will not be much more recommended than an entity that has around n-min star views. And then here at the denominator, now you add this NE views, which is the actual number of views of the entity. So typically, if gamma star here is equal to 1, you can see that this is going to be decreasing as the number of views increases, and it decreases logarithmically, which corresponds to the logarithmic scale of number of views. And gamma star here would control how much you care about discoverability. So the more larger gamma star, the more you care about having a bias towards videos, entities that have few views. So discoverability bias may be integrated directly by Alice. So Alice is the consumer, the one who receives the recommendations. So she may choose herself, so it can be parameterizable. She can choose to really have this discoverability bias, or maybe she does not really want this and wants more to see what's trending. But it can also be integrated by the user themselves who wants to promote entities that have too few views. So in terms of interpretation here, gamma star means caring more about discoverability, and n star means if you take larger value of this, it means that you're treating videos that have fewer than n star mean views similarly. Another kind of bias which I think would be interesting, though it may raise a bit of issues with especially filter bubbles, is the semantic bias. So both, again, from the user, the recommender and the recommendee side, you can want to bias your recommendations and to increase the recommendations of entities that have that are specific to a certain topic, for instance. So one way to do this, I mean, this is not the only way, but one way to do this is using vector embedding. So this is very classical in machine learning. So you consider vector embedding of each entity. Alice could have a textual description of her feed preferences. Maybe she can write, I prefer to be recommended topics about X, Y, or Z. And then you would construct a vector embedding based on this feed preference announcement. And one classical measures of similarity would be this one. And here again, you would have this hyperparameter gamma semi-angle here. I took this notation because this quantity corresponds to measuring an angle. I mean, I'm not going to go too much into the mathematical details, but the larger this value, the more there will be a bias that sticks to Alice's declared feed preferences. Now, it's unclear to me that this is working very well. The advantage here is that it could be computationally reasonable. I mean, you would go through all of the entities once, and then to Alice feed preference once. But you could have something different where typically you would, whenever Alice is asking for recommendations, you run a language model to evaluate the similarity between the entities and Alice feed preference. Yeah, I mean, there are maybe different instantiations of the semantic bias, but this is definitely something that could be naturally included into Veche. And finally, one last bias, I think is the last one, is the lifetime bias, meaning that Alice could have preferences about what kind of lifetime entity, what kind of entities with which lifetime she prefers to be exposed to. So this would correspond to this equation here. Tau Alice would be the lifetime she prefers, and Tau Yui would be the lifetime given to the entity. And yeah, in this setting, the minimum here, I mean, this is maximized. This value is maximized when the lifetime of the entity matches the lifetime preferred by Alice. And if it's too divergent, it's penalized. Okay, again, if you have any question, feel free to ask, don't hesitate. Now I'm going to move to another interesting feature of Veche, which is user volumes. It's something that was also present in Factor, that app that was presented by Laurent. The idea of volume is essentially you're giving different amount of voting rights to the different users you follow. You follow more or less different people, and some of them can have large volumes, others have smaller volumes, and they don't affect much what you see. Now the integration is quite straightforward. If someone is VU is the volume of user U, then instead of taking the sum of the normalized ballots here, you would take the weighted sum of the ballots, weighted by the volumes. You could imagine having a time decaying volume, meaning that when you follow someone, you really follow them when you follow them, but over time it decreases. And typically here, the typical time scale could typically correspond to maybe 3 years, something like this. After 3 years, you follow them twice less because well, you didn't renew your interest in this user. You could also have a like-based volume updates. I mean, I should say also, you could have interfaces where you're controlling the volumes of every individual user you follow. That would be nice. But you can also have something a bit more automated based on what you like. And essentially, when you like content from a user that was recommended by a user, it's as though you were saying to the algorithm, I like this kind of recommendations made by this user, so I will increase the volume of the user who made these recommendations to me. Again, you could have some time decay of this, but this could be a way to have a regular updates of the volumes. Now, one thing I think is interesting through this formalization is that we formalize the principle thereby. And the principle is the following, is that likes inform on what a consumer wants for themselves, whereas repost and reports inform on what they want for their followers. And more generally, I think it's interesting to make these kind of clarifications about what the different actions we make mean and what they imply algorithmically. So I think this is a nice way to do this. Now, this is something maybe up to debate, so I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but we could also add the non-followed users to our feed. Typically, and this would typically occur when these users are either mentioning the consumer, so the non-followed users are mentioning Alice, or they're replying to Alice. Maybe Alice may want this to be included in her feed. This is not the case in the chronological feed, by the way. So you have a separate mentions and reply feed. If you do this, then one thing I think would be desirable is that a non-followed account should not have more impact than a followed account. And also the aggregation of all non-followed accounts must not have an impact, must not have more impact than the aggregation of all followed accounts. typically to prevent mass cyberbullying, for instance. So this would be formalized by this equation. So I'm not sure this would be done. I'm just putting it out there that it's a possibility. But I think one potentially interesting implication of that is that if we do this, then we may be saying in some sense that I don't like the fact that I have this mention and reply feed. Maybe I don't even like notifications in general. Maybe they could be considered as a dark pattern. That's maybe up to some future debate, legal debate. And maybe I just want these notifications to be part of my feed, of my just exposure to information, and I want to control who gets to influence me better. So this would be one way of having a better control of who influences me, and would not be sufficient to mention me or to reply to me to have a lot more influence on me through notifications and a specific feed. I'm not sure it's a great idea, but yeah, it's a proposal. Now, one other axis of generalization of Veche is Ballot normalization. So right now we consider the L1 norm, meaning that if you promote F from two entities, E and F, then once they're normalized, and assume you only promote them and you promote them at the same time, then once they are normalized, your voting right essentially would be split between the two, and it would mean that you would be pushing E twice less because you're also pushing F. And I think this is quite reasonable if you thinking of publication. So if you're publishing more, it should not give you a competitive advantage. But on Tournesol, especially, we want to encourage people to evaluate more entities and to sort of participate in the collective curation of content. And so it could be a good idea to incentivize reposting a lot of entities or reporting a lot of entities. And one way to do this is through this idea of quadratic voting. So quadratic voting is this idea where you can, so it originated from very different considerations. I mean, not very different, but slightly different considerations, let's say. And the idea is that when you promoting both E and F, here in quadratic voting, you would give to E and F less weight than if you were only pushing E, but not twice less. Here would be you would be giving 1 divided by square root of 2, which is 0.71, which is larger than 0.5. And so this would be interesting because you're encouraging people to repost a lot, because you actually gain more influence by reposting a lot of content. And so this would be a way to encourage participation in the creation process. Formally, it would correspond to demanding that the quadratic norm, the L2 norm of the normalized vector be of norm 1. And in fact, it could even be generalized to LQ norm. So not giving the details, those of you who know what it is will know what I'm hinting at. But using the LQ norm, you could define this. And you could even have, instead of normalizing, completely dividing, you could have this other thing, which would allow user U to not use their full rights of influence. So why would you do this? So typically, if they are not very active on the platform, they could be asking their recommender, their algorithmic representative, to not weigh in too much, to avoid providing bad recommendations to the user, to the user they are recommending content to. So that's also a possibility. Here, the value of Q, the larger Q is, the more you sort of incentivizing people to post, to promote a lot of things. So technically, in Tournesol, Q is essentially infinite, meaning that you don't you are incentivized to recommend as many content as to evaluate as many entities as possible on Tonosol. So I've already hinted at this, but typically you could use different norms for different types of signals, and more generally, you could treat them separately. So typically, posts would be normalized in a way, whereas upvotes, which would correspond to repost on Blue Sky, reposting others' posts or reports here. These could be treated separately, and you would have a separate normalization for the different factors. You could also give a different weight to the different signals. So typically, if you take alpha up here to be larger than 1, it means that reposting matters more than posting, which could be an interesting feature. And similarly, if alpha down here is large, it means that whenever you're reporting an entity, you're really reporting it, like you're really penalizing it. It means, it could mean, I mean, this depends on actual human behavior, so it's not extremely clear, but it could mean that highly divisive entities that part of the population does not want to be to see a part of your forward accounts do not want want not to be promoted, rather, these would really not appear in your feed. And you could also use different values of Q. So I think Q post would be equal to 1 would be quite reasonable here, because it de-incentivizes massive content production. But if you take large values of Q up and Q down, then you're incentivizing massive content evaluation, which could be nice. Okay. Another kind of improvements upon Veche is feed diversification. So feed diversification typically means that you don't want to be recommended twice entities from the same user. And so the idea of when there's a nice algorithm that appeared called the TS pivot algorithm that allows to guarantee this. It's an iterative algorithm, so it's replacing the sampling without replacement. The idea is instead is iterative division. So instead of iterative addition, is you remove entities that are not worth adding to the user's feed. And the way you do this is you have this list of entities, and every time at each step you're going to select 2 entities. And you're going to say, out of these 2 entities, I'm going to remove one of them. And the way you decide which one is removed, you sort of make them compete. And so with a certain probability here, with this probability, you eliminate one, otherwise you eliminate the other. Here, essentially, the one with a lower weight will be more likely to be eliminated. And one nice trick of the algorithm is that the winning entity will still the weight of the loser entity, meaning that the one that remains gains the weight W plus WF. This makes it more likely then to survive, because it's already survived this challenge. Then it will be more likely that it survives. And a nice theorem. So I don't know the reference, so I'm still trying to find the reference. It was explained to me by a colleague of Matteo, but I don't have the reference. But the theorem, I mean, this one, I proved it myself. I mean, sketched the proof. It says the probability that E wins the tournament, that is the first in the field, the last one remaining, is going to be equal to this quantity. So it is the same as the one we had earlier. So meaning that the probability that E wins the tournament is proportional to its weight WE. Now, one thing that should be specified still is how do you select the pair of entities to be matched? And one nice thing is that if you first sample similar entities, then they will be unlikely to be recommended both, because they will be competing very early on, and so they cannot be remaining in the feed. And so the idea now is to first have a measure of similarity and to use this to first draw similar entities. And one way to do this is to look at the Pearson correlation between the ballots of E and F. Essentially, it says that here rho EF, so the correlation will be high if E and F are promoted by the same users and downgraded by the same users. And so by doing this, I can then construct a probability of being selected that corresponds to that essentially is a rho EF, more or less some normalization. And if I do this, then I increase the diversity in my feed, meaning that the feed overall, like the entities that are recommended, will tend to be recommended by different subsets of the users that I'm following. So this is one way also to improving the recommendations of the minorities within the sets of users that are following, that I am following, which I think is an interesting feature as well. It's also a way to increase diversity of viewpoints in one's feed. A small note is that, this approach here would be quadratic in the number of entities. So if you already think of Blue Sky, the number of entities is already too large. So you need heuristics to simulate this. So that one part is not defined, and I don't have guarantees. I don't have a heuristic, and definitely not guarantees on the heuristic that I could come up with. So now most of what we've seen is on Alice's side, so on the user who receives, on the side of the user that receives the recommendations. Alice can tweak her recommendations. So this would be the cause for parameterizable recommender systems. But you can have also further customizations of the algorithmic representatives. I mean, we already saw some of these. But one thing that could be ideal is liquid democracy, meaning that by default, I could say, well, I want to, by default, relay the recommendations made by another user. So typically, I could say, well, especially for users who are interested in, about climate, so I know they will bias their ballots because they want to be shown more entities about climate. Then I could bias them using this. So Emmanuel, sorry, I'm going to cut your mic because it's a bit noisy. But feel free to demute yourself and ask questions if you have any question. So yeah, the relay could typically be a number between 0 and 1. And then you will have the ballot you actually submit would be, that a user actually submits. They would first query the ballots that other users that they relay want to submit, and they would normalize this, and then they would apply this to end up with an actual ballot to be submitted. And BTLV could also be biased itself before it is injected. So there could typically be an interest in having this semantically restricted relay. Another interesting feature I think that could be developed is to have an interface that allows each user that is making recommendations, so essentially any user, to have a visual for what it is that they have recommended in the past and that they will recommend in the future. So typically, this could be a bit abstract, but here each curve here corresponds to an entity that the user is recommending. So typically here, back in the past, they were really mostly recommending the red entity. And then at some point they started to recommend the blue entity, and then the orange entity, and then the green entity. And what I want to highlight here are different interesting features. For instance, here, the red entity is decreasing quite fast, whereas the blue one is decreasing quite slow. This would correspond to typically different lifetimes. So typically here, the lifetime of the red one would correspond typically to 4 days, something like this. whereas the one of the blue one would correspond to 2 weeks maybe. Like the orange here is somewhat would be someone typically here that would correspond to some relay, and maybe first I relayed it because some user that I relay recommended it, but then at some point I actually watched it and I actually reposted it, so I'm actually now pushing it myself essentially. And so you can see that, for instance, now at this point in time, the entity that my algorithmic representative is pushing the most is the orange one ahead of the green one, but it's also pushing the blue and a bit the red. And also can look at the future. In the future, if I do nothing, then next week my algorithmic representative will be pushing the orange entity, a bit of the blue and the green, but you won't be pushing the red one anymore. So maybe this is a bit too advanced. I don't know how to make it too more user friendly. But also you can use this to ideally allow the user to tweak the algorithmic representative. Like maybe once they view this, they can say, actually, I want to recommend the blue one a lot more, or the red one a lot more. And maybe you can add some features that allows a modification or even a way to modify what it is that your algorithmic representative is pushing right now and will be pushing in the future.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If you make it, did you think about how it is shown to other users? For example, when I repost something, I think I recommend it more. But if I move my parameters, is there anyone who can show that, who can watch that?
So I'm not sure I understood. Can you repeat?
For example, if you repost something, you will recommend it. But if you don't repost it, but as you say, we can watch our recommendations, and we can move our parameters to make them more or less recommended. But these parameters are not like a repost or a thumb or anything like this. So is there a way for other users to remark, to se rendre compte what I boost?
Okay. So are you asking because this figure here? I mean, it could be up to the user to make this figure public, right? I don't know if it would answer your question, but
yes. And you said that in a second it can be possible to make the blue one, for example, higher than it will be next week. But if you do it when you see the graph and you say, "Oh no, I disagree with this graph. I prefer the blue above the orange one."
yeah.
Will other users see this? I think for example, for the red, it's like a thumb or like a repost. But if you want to change your recommendations, can you show this to other users? For example, a notification or something like this.
Okay, so I mean the answer is no, because I mean not directly, because the idea is really the other user is only seeing their feed and see. But there's also something interesting I haven't discussed about. I think it's important to. I mean, one reason I haven't discussed this is because we don't control on Tournesol we control the interfaces, and could be interesting to investigate this. But on Blue Sky, we don't. We would not be in control of the interface. But I think it would be interesting to highlight in one's feed for each post who are the people who are really pushing the post the most. So if the user suddenly pushes a lot the blue, then it increases the odds that if you are following this user, you are going to see the blue entity at some point in your feed. And what would be nice is that in this feed you really see who is pushing this entity. What is the reason why you see this entity? Because it would create something more social. I think it would be very interesting. And you could see also to the extent to which they are pushing this entity, which could then influence, if you like the entity, the volume of this user. So I don't know if it answers your question, but I think this is something we should definitely look into for Tournesol. And maybe in the future we can also discuss with Blue Sky if they are really into these ideas to increase the social dimension of recommender systems.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, it's almost over. I want to say a few words about future-proofing Veche. So I could be talking about this for a long time, but time is running by. So I think by construction, Veche is extremely interoperable because like Veche accepts any Ballot BU, which means that the recommender humans, the users that are recommending content, they could be using any kind of algorithmic recommenders, algorithmic representative. So they could construct any kind of algorithm that at any point submits Ballot BU. So they don't have to be restricted to the framework or the specific framework I've presented here. So you could consider completely different alternative algorithmic representative, as I said. So technically, BU could even be considered as a subvector. Could only specify some coordinates. And even Veche could be generalized. And if we define well the interaction, what needs to be sent as a Ballot, you could consider alternative to Veche. I already have ideas for alternatives, but they are less explainable, but arguably better behaved, based on geometric medians and stuff like this. Anyways, I won't go into the details. Another interesting feature is that it's by nature also quite decentralized, meaning that Alice could host her own Veche server, and the Veche server could collect ballots upon feed query, meaning that the algorithmic representative could themselves be decentralized. So each user could have their own algorithmic representative server that Veche would be querying. The issue with this is that it could be too slow because Veche would have to query information from many different servers if you do this. And so that's why I like the idea of Veche for this, is that in a sense, because of speed limitations, it's useful to gather all of the algorithmic representatives of the different followed accounts on the Veche server, and the Veche server will execute them to know what they recommend, and then the Veche server will be doing the aggregation and construct the feed. So this means the followed users would have to submit, and they could update at any time, algorithmic representatives that are functions that can be called at any point in time to provide the vectors, the Ballot BU. Now, this is something for the future, not saying that we should do this now, but You could also have some correctness guarantees based on verifiable computing, especially leveraging snarks, so that the users know that Alice knows that the Veche server is behaving correctly, and that the follow users know that the algorithmic representatives were faithful, especially if all of this is hosted in third-party servers. I think privacy also could be interesting to interesting research questions, at least at this point, because you could imagine a server that wants to recommend an entity to their followers without the followers knowing that it comes from the user. At least they could want this without recommend content without this being known to the Veche server, which could be different from not controlled by the Alice. And maybe this could be done by combining mixednets, homomorphic encryption, and zero-knowledge proofs. Probably not easy, but probably feasible. One other question that is not easy, I think one thing that is a big issue on social media is the issue of influencers, because an influencer is kind of literally someone who has a lot of influence. And arguably, it's not sound for democracy if you have these nodes that have too much influence. And in its current form, Veche allows a user to have many followers with many volumes, with also many relays. And this could create some node in the system that have a lot of influence. And this is something which is not safe. I'd say it's not making the system resilient. And so that's why maybe a full decentralization raises this kind of issue. And so you may need some coordination solution to limit the maximal influence of any user, and to especially implement what we defend a lot on Tonsor, which is the presumption of non-recommendability, meaning that an entity should not be massively recommended to millions of users, at least not until it has been assessed as actually recommendable by some authorities or citizens, diverse grounds of assembly of citizens or something like this. I mean, we're not against the entity being recommended hundreds or thousands of times, but maybe there should be a limit. Like, for instance, you should not be recommended more than 1,000 times per day. And you could even make this more precise within the Veche framework by saying that a single user cannot have more than 1,000 points of influence in a single day, but this would require some coordination, which corresponds to algorithms that have yet to be designed at this point. Okay, so we've gone through Veche. So this is very I mean, a first attempt, let's say, to evaluate Veche on the four pillars of digital democracy that we've defined in Chronosol. And I've added a fifth one, which is not a pillar, it's a user experience. So this is my personal evaluation, and we should debate it. But I think it would be interesting if we somehow vote for this at some point and have a collaborative evaluation of the different recommender systems. So the first one is proprietary engagement maximization. I think we all agree that it's very opaque, highly insecure, with a lot of astroturfing. It's like optimizing for the unthoughtful part of us, and it's creating a lot of divergence. And arguably, even in terms of UX, it's gone worse, and people are recognizing the mental health issues with this. So overall, bad, very bad. So I put then matrix factorization, which is a classical algorithm from research and has been deployed a lot. It's more transparent because we know how it works. It's still highly insecure and very vulnerable to fake accounts. It's not providing, I mean, it's more likes maybe there's less like the scoring and stuff like this, so it's not as bad in terms of being thoughtful, but it's not great. It's definitely not uniting. It's like highly personalized. In terms of UX, maybe it's good. It's not as like there's not like the bad side effects as engagement maximization, but it's not great. But it's not ideal either. I mean, maybe the UX scores are all too low here, but so the reverse chronological feed, it's very transparent because it's very clear how it works. I put it as not highly secure because it allows users that are really productive to gain more influence. That's why I put D here. It's not that full. Maybe I should have put C here, but the advantage of the reverse chronological feed is that you still select who you follow. So it's more thoughtful, arguably, when you're selecting who you follow, you're thinking more than when you're putting a like. It's not uniting, even when it's highly personalized. In terms of UX, it's probably the worst in all of these. So then I put Veche 0.0, so it's like the first version I put here. So it's quite transparent, quite easy to explain. So it's essentially like voting by sampling. So I put it as more secure than reverse chronological because now you're resilient against highly active accounts you follow. It's not promoting thoughtfulness more than reverse chronological, and it's as high. It's also very personalized. In terms of UX, I put D. So Chronofair. So Chronofair would be a version of Veche which has yet to be fully defined, but it's essentially like trying to pick up the things that are reasonable in the presentation I made. So it would be less transparent because it does require a bit more explaining, but like the base principle I think is still quite understandable. It's I think as secure as Veche 0.0. I think it's in terms of thoughtfulness, it's not much more. And it's a bit more uniting, especially if you have the TA pivot algorithm, because it's like valuing more like the small minorities within the subset of people that you follow. So that's why I put D. In terms of UX, I mean, it's a big question mark in reality, but I put C, hopefully. I'm not sure what it actually will yield in practice. And then I think the optional proposal, but I put it here, but I think it's like I don't have actually a solution because you have to certify accounts and so on. It's not like a well-defined algorithm, but one thing we could be striving for is like having like say 70% of the recommendations from Chronofair and 30% from something like Tournesol. It could be quite as transparent as Chronofair, arguably. Could be made more secure if you have like security about how to give voting rights to the different accounts. Like through something like, I mean, we would probably need to involve more interfaces that are like promoting more like the interfaces the kind of I shown earlier, but you could have more thoughtfulness through these kind of systems. I mean, I feel like this is more like wishful than actual B. And it could be a lot more uniting by favoring entities that are pushed by across parties. In terms of UX, hopefully we can still have something that's quite usable. Now, a few of the next steps if you want to make this a reality. So I see questions from Seb before I go to the next steps. Could it be that my algorithmic representative is to be hosted on my personal computer or on a secure other server for its weights are highly personal, and it could be a real problem to if accessed by a malevolent third party, have them all hosted on one same server might seem like a security flaw. Yeah, I mean, these are very interesting questions. I drafted issues with this, like research questions rather related to this. I mean, on personal computer, probably not, because you probably want to be always live, active. I mean, it could be your personal server then. Probably doable. I mean, your algorithmic representative no. The issue is that in terms of like if everyone had on their local machine, there could be a time issue, because the virtual servers that want to collect the algorithmic representative votes would have to call a lot of machines, and then either they wait for everyone to answer. I mean, it could be the case that most of the time it's fine, but we have to expect this to be slow every now and then. Like once machine is slow typically, and then here slow, like I mean more than 1 second, and if it's more than 1 second, I think the user experience gets very bad quickly for the user who are asking for their feed. So that's kind of unacceptable in the current ecosystem. So you need to be faster. So that's why I think eventually you will need to upload your algorithmic servers on some Veche server. And I think the question is, can I make sure that the computing of the Veche server is privacy preserving and verifiable? And I think these are very, very interesting questions. I think the answer is yes. They could be encrypted and do everything we want in principle. But doing so requires a lot of research. So exciting research from the research side, but not easy from a deployment perspective. So the next steps from here, I mean, there are still many conjectures. I think by now I'm pretty sure that all of them are true. In the draft paper that I'm writing, it's just a matter of writing the proofs, but I mean they still need to be written. Now then you would need to implement Veche, so this has left to be done. I don't see any particular change, but like, it needs to be done well. Then we need to test and evaluate Veche. The evaluation is unclear how to do this. I mean, you could at least evaluate in terms of speed, but yeah, the test and evaluation, I think the real one would be deployment and user survey. Then you need to precisely define chronosphere by especially selecting the hyperparameters that I've discussed and so on, making all design choices. I think this should be done collectively. I mean, I have thoughts, but ideally, I should not be dictatorial about this. So this requires many of you, hopefully, to better understand these algorithms. I think it's important to have different flavors of chronoflare, probably different names as well, and to propose them as different feeds that are proposed by Tournesol.app on Blue Sky. Also, if you think about Tournesol as well, I think it's good also to deploy these on Tournesol, especially, I mean, the one straightforward one would be having followed I mean, subscriptions, YouTube subscriptions on Tournesol, but you could also develop the social dimension of Tournesol as well. I would really enjoy it if I could share, and maybe we could have also algorithmic representatives that are specific to some user. Maybe I can say, well, to IDAN, for instance, I really want to recommend this entity to IDAN. And to the others, I have my default algorithmic representative. Then, yeah, deploying chronosphere to Tournesol, I think, would be quite interesting. Of course, deploying chronosphere to Blue Sky is an important goal. Conduct user survey and have feedbacks, especially about the hyperparameters. I know, for instance, that the share button was really dangerous on Facebook. It was discussed in the Facebook files. So is the repos going to be an issue if it's deployed at scale like this? I don't know. Does it need to have interfaces that are eliciting more thoughtful judgments? Maybe. How do you make the distinctions between the two? I don't know. There's a lot of open research questions in terms of UX UI and HCI, human-computer interface. But then hopefully we have all of this and we can write and submit a beautiful research paper. I think could be a very interesting paper. Then we need to promote Veche or chronosphere, I'd say, in the media and to politicians. I mean, we should definitely reach out to the network of journalists that we have, and also reach out to politicians. And then I think ultimately the key, the huge success would be if Blue Sky makes our algorithms default on Blue Sky. Same with Mastodon, and hopefully eventually even the Netherlands will consider it as the default algorithm to be used on social media. And finally, there's one last step that I've added, will be to refuse Musk's purchase offer. I mean, this is going to be easy because it's free open source. But I think we all agree we'll do this. So thank you for your attention, and feel free to ask questions.
Thank you very much. I have a question. I am not a mathematician, so it's perhaps not a presentation for me, but would it be possible to make all these proposals in a natural language?
Yes.
Then we can discuss about it and try to talk about this.
Yes, I mean, I have a draft which I will send because hopefully now it's more like the main part has become stable, so I can. I mean, has become. I've changed it today, but it's not that stable. But hopefully it's stable enough. So I will definitely send it to you. There's still a lot of math, but there's a lot of explanations as well. So it's, yeah, at this stage, in the sense, a bit challenging because I still need to clarify the math. But definitely, I think one thing that could be done, if you're interested in doing this, is having a team of people who are not, I mean, I could do this as well, but I think it would be interesting if other people than me try to explain it in language, in natural language terms, and then I can, of course, help. But I think it would be a good exercise to have others really understand these algorithms. Adrien?
Yeah, so I would have many questions about implementation details, and maybe that's not the best time. But still, one question, I think it applies both to Tournesol and Blue Sky if we want to deploy this kind of algorithms, is so one key parameter and metric is about the how to take into account the entity lifetime, if I understand, and even for basic deployment, I think that's a crucial part. So do you have any idea about how to evaluate the lifetime of entities?
So my basic proposal at this stage is simply to set default lifetime.
A fixed value, okay.
A fixed value on Tournesol, a fixed value on Blue Sky, which I think are different. So typically, we're suggesting like 1 day on Blue Sky and 2 weeks on Tournesol, or something like this. Yeah, I think allowing users, like especially recommending users, to set up themselves the lifetimes. This requires interfaces. future work, let's say.
But I guess we could imagine, I could imagine evaluating the I don't know, the evaluating lifetime depending on the channels or whatever. I don't know how to how the number of views evolve over time or something. No, I don't know.
So because another thing you can say is just ask ChatGPT. I mean, you can ask a language model to have an estimation, but I feel at this stage it's better to have something simple and under user control.
Sure. Because also the question we get regularly on Tournesol, right? We should try to distinguish between content that expires very, very quickly and things that are more universal and make sense to recommend even after several years. We don't have a good solution yet, I guess. But...
Yeah, I know.
Maybe I have a second question. In the table, when you summarize the different different properties of the approaches. So you described Chronofair as a better UX compared to the reverse chronological or even Veche 0.0. What is your intuition behind it? Or why would it be a better UX for you?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you will include on Chronofair, but typically if you can bias the recommendations based on declared preferences, on what were all of the things that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. If you have user volumes, typically, so if you have removing previously recommended entities, discoverability bias, I feel like this can add to your experience. I feel like another important advancement would be I feel like valuing social recommendations, like the fact that there are humans that are proposing this to you and you can react to this and you know who is recommending what. Mm-hmm. I feel like this could add even more because, I mean, these are social media, and back in the days, I think the social part was the important part of the success. And maybe because they've lost this today, and maybe if we can leverage this again, we can have, again, a competitive advantage in terms of user experience. So I guess that's why I was giving it better scores, but there's a lot of let's say wishful thinking, or at least rough approximations at this stage.
Yeah, I guess we need to try and try to get feedback. Yeah.
Cool. If there's no more questions, we can end here. Thank you for your attention, and hopefully, if you have any questions in private as well, or if you want to discuss it offline, more than happy to be discussing this.